The spring of 1829 arrived late in Maryland's Tidewater region, frost lingering well into April and delaying the planting season on estates that had depended on tobacco cultivation for more than a century. In the slave quarters of Ashford Hall, a sprawling plantation 20 miles south of Baltimore, workers spoke in hushed tones about a recent arrival who had to sleep diagonally across the largest cabin because no bed was long enough to accommodate him lying straight. According to local legend, this wasn't merely another enslaved person being absorbed into the declining economy of Maryland's exhausted agricultural lands. This was someone whose extraordinary physical presence would expose the fragility of the entire system of household control that distinguished Tidewater slavery from the brutal field operations of the Deep South. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 2 years would become a story preserved in oral traditions across the Upper South, a tale of how domestic service, supposedly the most controlled and civilized form of enslavement, could become a battleground where visibility itself became a weapon that no amount of careful management or refined cruelty could fully neutralize. Maryland in the late 1820s represented a slaveholding society in the midst of profound transformation. Caught between its origins as a tobacco colony and an uncertain future, as agricultural productivity declined and economic opportunities shifted toward urban commerce and manufacturing. The soil that had once produced the colony's wealth had been exhausted through generations of intensive tobacco cultivation, forcing planters to either shift to less profitable wheat and corn production or to recognize that their most valuable asset was no longer land, but the enslaved people who worked it. This recognition had transformed Maryland into a major source of enslaved labor for the domestic slave trade, with an estimated 30,000 people sold south and west between 1820 and 1830 alone, families torn apart to service debts and finance consumption that agricultural revenues could no longer support. The state's proximity to Pennsylvania and other free states created constant anxiety about escapes, leading to increasingly paranoid enforcement of slave codes and the development of professional slave catching as a major industry centered in Baltimore and other urban areas. The society that maintained this system operated through mechanisms that differed significantly from plantation slavery in the Deep South, with a much higher proportion of enslaved people working in domestic service, skilled trades, and urban occupations rather than gang labor in agricultural fields. Maryland slaveholders prided themselves on their refined approach to human bondage, claiming that their system was more humane and civilized than the brutal cotton plantations of Mississippi or Alabama. They pointed to lower rates of physical punishment, to the prevalence of skilled labor rather than field work, to the closer proximity between enslaved and enslaving families that household service created. But this self-image obscured a reality that was oppressive in its own particular ways. Domestic service meant constant surveillance and invasion of privacy that field workers sometimes escaped. Proximity to slaveholding families meant intimate exposure to their cruelty and moral corruption, and the threat of sale south hung over every Maryland enslaved person like a sword, transforming good behavior into desperate attempts to avoid being sold away from family and community into the hell of Deep South cotton production. The legal structures governing Maryland slavery reflected these anxieties and transformations, with slave codes that were simultaneously comprehensive in their denial of rights and somewhat less rigidly enforced than in states where enslaved populations outnumbered whites and generated constant fears of uprising. The law defined enslaved people as absolute property subject to their owners' complete control, yet also recognized them as persons for purposes of criminal prosecution, creating contradictions that courts navigated through interpretations that invariably favored slaveholder interests. Free black people existed in Maryland in larger numbers than in most slaveholding states, but under crushing restrictions that required registration, prohibited certain occupations, and subjected them to constant surveillance and potential re-enslavement through various legal mechanisms. Into this world of masked brutality and systematic degradation disguised as domestic refinement came someone who would demonstrate that household control was no more absolute than field discipline, that proximity and visibility could become liabilities rather than assets for those claiming ownership of human beings. Stories passed down through generations claim that Yao arrived at Ashford Hall in March 1829, purchased at a Baltimore slave market from an estate sale following the death of a Virginia planter who had maintained operations near Fredericksburg until financial collapse forced liquidation of all assets. The sale that brought Yao to market had included 47 people, entire families broken apart and sold to different buyers as the auctioneer worked through his inventory with the efficiency of any commercial operation. But from the moment Yao stood on the auction block in Baltimore's Pratt Street Market, where thousands of enslaved people were bought and sold annually under the tolerant gaze of city authorities who profited from the trade through licensing fees and taxes, he commanded attention that transcended routine commercial transactions. Standing 7 feet and 7 inches tall, with a physique that suggested both tremendous strength and a kind of physical grace that seemed almost impossible for someone his size, he literally towered over everyone in the crowded market hall, his head nearly touching rafters designed to accommodate normal human dimensions. Oral histories indicate that Yao's appearance generated immediate controversy among potential buyers, with some expressing explicit reluctance to bid, despite his obvious physical capabilities and the potential value such an extraordinary specimen might represent. The auctioneer's disclosure that Yao had been employed in household service rather than field labor in Virginia, that he possessed skills in carpentry and mechanical repair beyond normal expectations, should have increased his value in Maryland's labor market, where such capabilities commanded premium prices. But his extraordinary height created concerns that several planters voiced openly during the bidding. How could someone so physically imposing be safely employed in household service where he would be in constant proximity to white family members, where his presence might disturb the careful hierarchies that domestic slavery depended upon, where his very visibility would serve as a constant reminder of the physical power that enslaved people theoretically possessed, but were supposed to never be allowed to recognize or deploy? The winning bidder was Margaret Ashford, a widow who had inherited Ashford Hall from her husband 3 years earlier, and who managed the estate's declining fortunes with a combination of inherited wealth, careful economizing, and a reputation for refined household management that was supposed to exemplify Maryland's civilized approach to slaveholding. She paid an extraordinary sum, nearly $2,000, for Yao, a price that reflected both his skills and her particular needs for someone who could perform the heavy household maintenance work that the aging estate required. Mrs. Ashford purchased Yao with specific intentions that revealed both her commercial calculation and her need to maintain appearances among Maryland's Tidewater elite, women who measured each other's status partly through the quality and training of their household servants. She planned to employ Yao in mixed roles, heavy lifting and mechanical repairs that his size made him uniquely capable of performing, but also potentially as a footman or butler, whose extraordinary height would make dramatic impression on visitors and demonstrate Ashford Hall's continued prosperity, despite obvious economic decline. What Mrs. Ashford failed to anticipate, what her confidence in the refined mechanisms of household control prevented her from recognizing, was that she had purchased someone whose physical presence would make domestic service impossible to manage according to the careful scripts that Tidewater slavery had developed over generations. Yao's height meant he couldn't be rendered invisible in the ways that good household servants were supposed to be, couldn't fade into the background and perform his duties without drawing constant attention. His presence in any room dominated it completely, forcing recognition and acknowledgement that undermined the fiction of enslaved people as mere extensions of their owner's will with no independent existence or agency. Every time he entered a space, every time he performed even the most routine task, his extraordinary size created a spectacle that disrupted the careful choreography through which domestic slavery supposedly distinguished itself from the crude brutality of field operations. The rhythm of life at Ashford Hall followed patterns established through decades of Tidewater plantation operations, a carefully maintained routine that distinguished between field workers who labored in declining tobacco cultivation and wheat production, and household servants who worked in close proximity to the Ashford family under Mrs. Ashford's direct supervision. The main house, a Georgian mansion built in the 1760s when tobacco money still flowed freely, required constant maintenance and operated according to elaborate protocols that governed everything from morning routines to formal entertaining. Household servants were expected to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to perform their duties with perfect efficiency while remaining essentially invisible, to demonstrate through their trained behavior that slavery could be refined and civilized rather than merely brutal. Mrs. Ashford prided herself on managing her household servants through what she described as firm guidance rather than violence, claiming that proper training and the threat of sail south were more effective than the whip in maintaining appropriate behavior and extracting quality service. Yao worked in this environment from his first day at Ashford Hall, initially assigned to heavy maintenance tasks like moving furniture, repairing structural elements that required accessing high spaces, and performing carpentry work on outbuildings and estate infrastructure. But scattered documents hint that from the very beginning, his presence created complications that neither Mrs. Ashford nor her household manager knew how to resolve. His extraordinary height made even simple movements through the house problematic. Doorways built for normal-sized people required him to duck and turn sideways. Staircases forced him into awkward crouching that looked undignified and somehow threatening. His footsteps on wooden floors sounded like those of some massive creature, rather than a human servant going about assigned duties. When he worked in rooms where Mrs. Ashford or her daughters were present, his size made it impossible for them to ignore him in the ways that household service protocols demanded. His very visibility disrupting the careful fiction that enslaved people were mere tools, with no independent existence worthy of acknowledgement. Local tradition holds that the first serious crisis occurred within weeks of Yao's arrival, during a formal dinner party that Mrs. Ashford hosted for several neighboring planter families and Baltimore merchants with whom she maintained business relationships. She had decided to deploy Yao as a footman, positioning him at the dining room entrance where his extraordinary height would create impressive visual impact and demonstrate Ashford Hall's continued ability to afford exceptional household servants. But the plan backfired spectacularly in ways that Mrs. Ashford should have anticipated, but her vanity prevented her from recognizing. When Yao stood at his assigned position, towering over the dining table and the guests seated around it, his presence didn't enhance the evening's elegance. It dominated and disturbed it. Guests found themselves unable to ignore him, their conversations repeatedly interrupted by awareness of this massive figure standing silent and still, while they attempted to enjoy their meal. Some expressed discomfort that bordered on fear, unconsciously lowering their voices when discussing business or politics, as if worried that Yao's obvious intelligence might lead him to remember and perhaps repeat what he heard. What happened next, according to oral histories, established patterns that would define Yao's entire time at Ashford Hall and expose fundamental contradictions in the household service model of slavery. Mrs. Ashford, recognizing that her guests were uncomfortable, ordered Yao to leave the dining room and return to other duties. But in doing so, she inadvertently acknowledged that his presence disrupted the careful hierarchies that domestic slavery depended upon, that his size made him impossible to reduce to the invisibility that good household service required. Word of the incident spread through networks of enslaved people who worked in neighboring estates and through gossip among the planter families who had attended the dinner, creating stories that attributed to Yao a kind of power that existed simply in his undeniable physical presence. For enslaved communities, the tale became evidence that the master's control had limits, that someone sufficiently extraordinary could disrupt even the most carefully managed household operations. For slaveholding families, the story generated anxious conversations about whether employing someone like Yao in domestic service represented dangerous precedent that challenged assumptions about the safety and propriety of household slavery. By the summer of 1829, fragmentary records suggest that Mrs. Ashford had begun to recognize that her expensive purchase might have been a catastrophic miscalculation, that Yao's extraordinary qualities made him unsuitable for the roles she had envisioned despite his obvious capabilities. She attempted to restrict him to maintenance work that kept him away from family spaces and visiting guests, essentially treating him as a field worker who happened to live in the household quarters. But this created its own problems. Yao's skills in carpentry and mechanical repair were too valuable to waste, and restricting his movements meant limiting his ability to perform the very tasks that justified his high purchase price. More troublingly, from Mrs. Ashford's perspective, confining Yao to certain areas of the estate inadvertently created spaces where he operated with unusual autonomy, areas where household surveillance was less intense, and where he could interact with other enslaved workers without the constant monitoring that domestic service normally imposed. Whispered tales speak of Yao using this relative freedom to help other enslaved people at Ashford Hall in ways that were subtle enough to avoid provoking response, but significant enough to materially improve lives lived under systematic oppression. When performing repairs in the slave quarters, he would reinforce structures to provide better protection from winter cold, improvements that benefited residents, but that Mrs. Ashford's household manager interpreted as simple thoroughness rather than deliberate aid. He would create hiding places in outbuildings and barns where people could conceal items or rest away from supervision, small refuges that provided psychological relief from the constant surveillance that domestic slavery imposed. He shared his own larger food rations with families that were struggling, redistributing resources in acts of mutual support that slavery's economics claimed shouldn't exist. Most significantly, his physical presence in the quarters created a kind of protective effect. Overseers and household managers seemed unconsciously reluctant to inflict their usual casual cruelties when Yao was nearby, as if his size generated a fear that made them moderate their behavior even without any explicit threat or resistance on his part. The fall of 1829 brought developments that demonstrated just how widely Yao's reputation had spread beyond Ashford Hall, and how uncomfortable it made Maryland's slaveholding elite who prided themselves on their refined approach to human bondage. According to some accounts, visitors to the estate began specifically requesting to see the giant, treating Yao like some kind of attraction that they expected Mrs. Ashford to display for their entertainment. This attention was deeply problematic for a widow trying to maintain her social position through careful management of appearances and relationships. On one hand, Yao's presence demonstrated that Ashford Hall could still afford expensive acquisitions and maintained operations worthy of elite status. On the other hand, the nature of the attention suggested something was abnormal about the situation, that household slavery wasn't supposed to include someone so physically extraordinary that he became a topic of fascinated conversation, rather than fading into proper servant invisibility. Local tradition holds that Mrs. Ashford attempted to resolve this paradox through a series of increasingly desperate measures that revealed both her limited options and the fundamental impossibility of controlling someone whose very existence disrupted the careful fictions that household slavery depended upon. She ordered Yao to avoid being seen by visitors whenever possible, to work only in areas of the estate where guests wouldn't encounter him. But this proved impractical given his maintenance duties and the house's layout. And the attempts at concealment actually generated more interest and speculation, as visitors noticed his absence and wondered why such an extraordinary person was being hidden. She considered selling him to eliminate the problem, but doing so would mean admitting the purchase had been a mistake and taking a substantial financial loss that her precarious economic position couldn't easily absorb. She thought about employing him exclusively in field work, but this would waste his valuable skills and would also represent a kind of defeat, an acknowledgement that household slavery couldn't accommodate someone who challenged its basic assumptions about control and invisibility. By winter of 1830, scattered documents hint that tensions at Ashford Hall had escalated in ways that made some kind of crisis inevitable, that the contradictions inherent in Yao's position had become unsustainable for everyone involved. Mrs. Ashford's household manager, a white woman named Mrs. Holloway, who had worked at the estate for 2 decades and who managed household servants through a combination of detailed instruction and threatened punishment, reported increasing difficulty maintaining proper discipline and deference. She claimed that other household servants had become less subservient since Yao's arrival, more willing to question orders or perform duties according to their own judgment rather than following detailed instructions. Mrs. Holloway attributed this change to Yao's influence, though she couldn't point to any specific acts of defiance or encouragement of resistance. The problem was more subtle, a general shift in atmosphere that made the usual mechanisms of household control less effective. Oral histories claim that the crisis came to a head in January 1830, during an incident that would become legendary among enslaved communities throughout Maryland and that would haunt Mrs. Ashford for the rest of her life. According to these accounts, Mrs. Holloway decided to reassert her authority by publicly punishing Yao for some minor infraction, arriving late to assign duties, or performing work in a manner she deemed insufficiently careful. The household manager ordered Yao to submit to whipping in front of assembled household servants, intending the punishment to serve both as correction and as demonstration that no one, regardless of size or apparent value, existed beyond the reach of household discipline. But when Mrs. Holloway raised the whip, Yao didn't prepare to receive punishment as enslaved people were trained to do. Instead, local tradition holds that he simply looked down at her from his full 7-foot 7-inch height and spoke quietly, his words preserved in multiple retellings. "I have done nothing to deserve this. And you know it. If you strike me, you should understand that I will defend myself, and I am not responsible for what happens after that." The statement wasn't a direct threat of violence, but it was an acknowledgement of physical reality that household slavery preferred to keep unspoken, that someone of Yao's size possessed the capacity to resist any punishment through force if he chose to accept the consequences. Mrs. Holloway found herself in an impossible position, facing someone who had just calmly articulated the limits of her power in front of witnesses who would remember and spread word of what they had seen. Backing down would destroy her authority completely, but attempting to follow through on the threatened punishment might result in violence that could injure or kill her if Yao actually defended himself as he had suggested he would. Stories differ about exactly what happened next. Some claim Mrs. Holloway lowered the whip and walked away without another word, while others suggest she called for male overseers to help force Yao's compliance, but found them strangely reluctant to involve themselves in a confrontation that could end with serious injuries on both sides. What seems certain from fragmentary records and persistent oral tradition is that Mrs. Ashford, when informed of the incident, faced a crisis that exposed every contradiction at the heart of Maryland's supposedly refined approach to household slavery. Her entire social position depended on maintaining absolute control over her enslaved workers, on demonstrating that domestic service could be managed through training and proper discipline rather than the crude brutality of field operations. But Yao had revealed that this control was illusory when applied to someone who possessed both physical capacity for resistance and the intelligence to recognize that capacity without actually deploying it in ways that would justify lethal response. Mrs. Ashford could have Yao killed for threatening a white woman, but doing so would mean destroying valuable property and admitting publicly that she couldn't manage her own household. She could sell him immediately to remove the problem, but this would confirm that she had lost control and would damage her reputation among elite families who measured each other's competence partly through successful household management. She could attempt to have him severely punished as an example to other enslaved workers. But the risks of that confrontation were too great given his demonstrated willingness to defend himself. Local tradition holds that Mrs. Ashford chose the worst possible option from her perspective, but perhaps the only one available given her limited choices. She essentially conceded that Yao existed outside normal household discipline, that he would be allowed to work according to his own judgment without facing the constant surveillance and correction that governed other household servants' lives. This arrangement was never formally acknowledged or explicitly stated, but it governed daily operations at Ashford Hall for the next several months. Yao would perform his assigned maintenance and carpentry work with the skill and efficiency that justified his high purchase price. But he would do so according to his own schedule and methods without accepting detailed supervision or submitting to punishment for perceived inadequacies. Other household servants noticed this arrangement and understood its significance. Recognizing that someone had successfully challenged the system's claims of absolute control and achieved a measure of autonomy that slavery's ideology claimed was impossible. The consequences of this informal accommodation rippled through Ashford Hall and beyond in ways that vindicated every anxiety that Maryland slaveholders felt about household service and its potential to create dangerous proximity between enslaved and enslaving families. Other household servants at Ashford Hall began exhibiting what Mrs. Holloway described as inappropriate independence, questioning orders more frequently and performing duties according to their own judgment, rather than following detailed instructions. The household manager complained that discipline had collapsed, that the usual mechanisms of control through threatened punishment no longer generated the fear and immediate compliance they once had. Mrs. Ashford found herself managing a household that still functioned. Work still got done, meals still appeared on time, the estate still operated, but according to patterns that suggested enslaved workers possessed agency and made choices rather than simply following orders as human tools were supposed to do. By spring of 1830, scattered documents hint that word of Yao's situation had spread well beyond Ashford Hall, creating conversations among Maryland's slaveholding elite that mixed fascination with deep anxiety about implications that few wanted to examine directly. Other planters who heard the stories expressed concern that Mrs. Ashford's failure to control her household servant set dangerous precedents, that allowing any enslaved person to exist outside normal disciplinary structures threatened the entire system's stability. Some suggested that Yao should be sold south immediately regardless of financial loss, that eliminating his influence was more important than preserving property value. Others recognized that Yao's case exposed contradictions inherent in household slavery itself. The system required enslaved people to possess intelligence and capability sufficient to manage complex domestic tasks. But those very qualities enabled resistance when individuals chose to exercise agency rather than submit to dehumanization. A few in private conversations unlikely to be recorded even admitted that perhaps absolute control had always been more fiction than reality. That household slavery had always involved negotiations and accommodations that ideology denied but practical operations required. Fragmentary records from summer 1830 suggest that matters came to an unexpected resolution that may have represented Mrs. Ashford's desperate final attempt to eliminate the problem Yao posed to her household authority. According to some accounts, Yao was sold in July 1830 to a Baltimore merchant who intended to employ him in commercial operations rather than domestic service, work where his size and strength would be valuable assets and where the kinds of control issues that plagued household service would be less relevant. Other stories claim that Yao simply disappeared one night, vanishing from Ashford Hall with a completeness that suggested either escape to freedom or secret sale arranged to avoid public acknowledgement of Mrs. Ashford's failure to manage her own property. A few oral histories even suggest that Mrs. Ashford arranged for Yao to escape, recognizing that his continued presence would destroy her reputation and that helping him flee was preferable to the ongoing crisis his existence created. What happened to Yao after leaving or escaping from Ashford Hall remains one of those historical mysteries that generates endless speculation across different versions of the story. Some oral traditions claim he made it to Pennsylvania and eventually to Canada, using networks of free Black people and sympathetic Quakers to navigate the dangerous journey through a border region where slave catchers operated with impunity and captured people could be returned to bondage or sold south regardless of their legal status. Others suggest he remained in Baltimore, working as a supposedly free laborer, using forged papers that somehow withstood scrutiny despite Maryland's increasingly paranoid enforcement of laws controlling free Black people's movements. A few accounts place him on ships leaving Baltimore's harbor, suggesting he went to sea where his status would be ambiguous, and his size and strength would make him valuable enough that captains asked few questions about backgrounds. The truth, whatever it was, disappeared into the deliberate gaps and silences that characterized historical records of enslaved people who refused to accept their status. What is documented is the impact Yao's story had on conversations about household slavery in Maryland and across the Upper South in the years following his disappearance from Ashford Hall. Slaveholders who had prided themselves on their refined approach to human bondage, who had distinguished their supposedly civilized domestic service from the brutal field operations of cotton plantations, found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about control and its limits. If someone like Yao could disrupt even the most carefully managed household through simple physical presence and quiet assertion of human dignity, what did that suggest about the stability of the entire system? If household service created proximity and visibility that could become weapons when extraordinary individuals recognized and deployed them strategically, perhaps the vaunted refinement of tidewater slavery was actually a vulnerability rather than the advancement that planters claimed. These conversations, conducted in private and rarely committed to written records that might survive, revealed anxieties that contradicted public assertions about slavery's benign character and stable foundations. For enslaved communities throughout Maryland and beyond, Yao's story became part of a larger tradition of resistance narratives that preserved knowledge about power and its vulnerabilities across generations. Workers in household service spoke of the giant who couldn't be controlled, whose very presence had disrupted the careful hierarchies that domestic slavery depended upon, who had achieved a measure of autonomy through combination of physical extraordinariness and strategic intelligence. The story took on mythical dimensions in some tellings, attributing to Yao acts of defiance and assistance to others that might have been elaborations, but served essential purposes for communities desperate for examples of successful resistance. In the most optimistic versions, he became a figure who had not only escaped but who helped others flee, a giant who moved through the night liberating people from bondage. In more somber tellings, he remained a symbol of dignity, maintained despite systematic attempts to destroy it, proof that human worth couldn't be completely erased no matter how comprehensive the apparatus of oppression. The deeper truth that Yao's story illuminates transcends the specific details of what did or didn't happen at Ashford Hall between 1829 and 1830. His experience reveals fundamental contradictions that made household slavery as unstable as field operations, despite slaveholders' claims about refinement and civilization, distinguishing their approach from cruder forms of exploitation. Domestic service required enslaved people to possess intelligence and capability sufficient to manage complex household operations, to anticipate needs and solve problems with minimal supervision. But those very qualities enabled resistance when individuals recognized their own capacity for agency and chose to exercise it despite the risks. Household service created proximity and visibility that was supposed to enable better control through constant surveillance. But for someone like Yao, that visibility became a weapon that disrupted the careful fictions household slavery depended upon. The fiction that enslaved people could be rendered invisible while performing their duties. The fiction that physical presence didn't matter as long as proper deference was maintained. The fiction that control was absolute when it was actually contingent on enslaved people, accepting their status rather than challenging it. Yao's extraordinary height made these contradictions impossible to ignore or obscure through the usual mechanisms of household management. His 7'7" frame meant he couldn't be rendered invisible in any space he occupied, couldn't fade into the background as good household servants were supposed to do. His physical presence forced recognition of his existence as an individual with obvious capabilities and inherent dignity, created situations where the usual protocols of domestic service revealed their arbitrary and oppressive character. When Mrs. Ashford attempted to display him to visitors as evidence of her continued elite status, she inadvertently demonstrated that he couldn't be reduced to mere property or ornament. When Mrs. Holloway attempted to punish him to reassert household discipline, she discovered that physical intimidation only worked when the person being intimidated was smaller and weaker. Encountering someone who possessed superior physical capacity exposed the violence underlying supposedly refined household management. Stories passed down through generations preserve knowledge about resistance in household service that official documents systematically excluded, knowledge about how enslaved people maintained dignity and exercised agency, even in spaces designed to strip away both through constant surveillance and demanded deference. These oral traditions tell us that domestic workers developed sophisticated understandings of the psychology of control, recognizing the difference between actual power and the performance of power that household slavery required enslaved people to validate through their subservient behavior. They understood that refusing to play assigned roles could disrupt the entire system, even without open defiance, that strategic assertions of human worth could create spaces of relative autonomy within comprehensive oppression. And they preserved stories of individuals like Yao, who embodied these principles, who demonstrated through their own experiences that household slavery's claims of civilized refinement masked relationships of violence and domination that differed only in style rather than substance from the brutal field operations that Tidewater planters claimed to despise. The fact that we cannot verify every detail of Yao's story with documentary precision does not diminish its essential truth or its importance for understanding slavery and resistance in all their complex dimensions. The story carries the weight of lived experience transmitted through communities that understood the particular vulnerabilities and possibilities inherent in household service, that knew which truths could be safely recorded and which had to be preserved in oral traditions operating outside official channels. It speaks to the creative intelligence that enslaved people brought to the fundamental problem of maintaining humanity in systems designed to destroy it, to the countless ways they found to resist even when direct confrontation meant death or sail south to worse fates. The fragmentary nature of the historical record itself tells a story about how power works to preserve narratives, serving its interests while erasing evidence of failures and limitations. Slaveholders kept detailed records of household expenses and estate operations, but rarely documented moments when their authority was successfully challenged, or when enslaved people demonstrated capabilities contradicting the racist ideology justifying their enslavement. The legacy of Yao and others like him resonates across American history because it reminds us that slavery in all its forms was always contested, always resisted, always undermined by people who refused to accept the status it tried to impose. Every assertion of control revealed its own limits to those paying attention. Every claim of civilized refinement masked violence and coercion that occasionally broke through carefully maintained appearances. Every attempt to render enslaved people invisible and subordinate encountered individuals whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions the system depended upon. The enslaved people who worked in household service throughout Maryland and across the South maintained their humanity through countless acts of resistance, both dramatic and subtle, preserved memories and traditions that contradicted official narratives, created communities of mutual support that sustained people through systematic degradation, and made survival possible when the system seemed designed to make it impossible. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities kept alive when official history tried to erase them, that resistance and dignity stood 7 feet 7 inches tall, impossible to hide or reduce to proper servant invisibility, generating fear and discomfort in those who claimed absolute control. creating spaces of autonomy through strategic deployment of physical presence combined with quiet assertion of human worth, demonstrating that even the most supposedly refined and civilized form of slavery contained contradictions and vulnerabilities that could be exposed by someone with the vision to see them and the courage to act. Yao's presence at Ashford Hall lasted barely more than a year, but his impact rippled through household service operations and enslaved communities across generations, creating stories that inspired others to recognize that the master's power was never as absolute as they claimed. That resistance was possible in forms beyond dramatic escape or violent rebellion, that human dignity could not only survive, but could actually disrupt and challenge even the most carefully managed systems of oppression. The truth of these stories lies not in their precise factual accuracy, but in the experiences they represent and the knowledge they preserve. Knowledge about how people maintained agency under comprehensive control, about how they created meaning in circumstances designed to render their lives meaningless, about how they kept alive the dream of freedom and dignity, even when achievement seemed impossibly distant.